The sun rose like a blessing that morning, spilling golden light over the clay rooftops and sweeping through the compound like it too had been invited to the ceremony. Drums were already beating in the distance. Smoke from roasting yams curled skyward. Women with wrapped heads and jingling beads moved between huts like a procession of butterflies. It was not just any day, it was the day Adiku, daughter of Obadiah the potter, was to become a wife. Her mother adjusted her coral beads and dabbed the corner of her eye. "Ah, Adiku, you're too beautiful today," she whispered, but her voice trembled as if beauty could also be a curse. Adiku, seated on a low stool, stared straight ahead as women painted delicate white lines across her collarbone. Her back was straight, her jaw set. She said little. Not out of fear, but because something deep inside her refused to dance along with the occasion. The elders from the groom's family were expected by the third beat of the drum. And true to form, they arrived in a line. 7 men, 1 woman, and 2 young boys carrying baskets covered with palm leaves. The gifts were generous. Dried fish, fine wrappers, 2 goats tied together with raffia. The compound shifted. People sat straighter, whispered softer. Adiku's father, Obadiah, met them at the compound center. His hands were dusty from clay, though he tried to wash them 3 times. He greeted them with bows, offered kola nuts, and beckoned the village elder to preside. A talking drum began its rhythm. Calabashes of palm wine were passed. But there was something missing in the air. A current beneath the joy, like a river swollen and unsure. The spokesman from the groom's side, Elder Okeke, rose with a polite cough. He smiled, but it did not touch his eyes. "We thank this house," he began, "for giving us a daughter full of wisdom and pride." The way he said pride made a few necks twist. Adiku shifted on her stool. "We brought bride price to honor tradition," he continued, voice louder now, "but our son has reflected, and we must return what was offered." A gasp spread across the compound. Her mother's hand flew to her chest. The drummers stopped. Even the goats stilled. "What is this?" Obadiah asked, stepping forward. Another man, a young messenger perhaps no older than 20, stepped forward and gently placed the baskets back in the center of the compound. Then he spoke. "She insulted my mother when we visited. She does not bend her knees. She does not lower her voice. She is too bold. She said she would choose her own land for her kitchen." A hush followed. Then someone in the crowd let out a nervous laugh, as if hoping it was a misunderstanding. But the elder's next words confirmed everything. "Her pride makes her unmarriageable. Forgive us. We return these gifts with respect." And just like that they turned to leave. "No," Adiku's mother whispered, then louder, "No, no, this cannot, please." One of the women who'd been arranging food near the corner let out a high-pitched wail. A toddler started crying. Obadiah stepped back, shaking his head, clay still beneath his fingernails, as if trying to grip onto anything that would stop this unraveling. Then the messenger, almost ceremonially, lifted a calabash of palm wine, and dashed it to the earth. It shattered. The wine spilled like blood. Another calabash. Then another. The sound of breaking vessels echoed through the compound like thunder without rain. A woman screamed. Another spat. Attica didn't cry. She stood slowly. The white lines on her body still perfect. Her wrapper still tied. Her dignity strangely intact. She looked directly at the young man who had accused her, and in a calm voice asked, "Is it pride to want to plant my own yam?" He flinched. Then she turned to her father, who couldn't meet her eyes. The elders were already leaving, goat ropes dragging behind them. Whispers rippled like snakes in the grass. Someone said, "She brought shame." Another murmured, "She's cursed herself." Her mother collapsed into a stool, burying her face in her lap. Attica wanted to reach for her, but knew it would only deepen her mother's sorrow. Instead, she walked to the center of the compound, bent down, and picked up the shattered calabash pieces one by one. No one helped her. She placed them gently into a woven basket. The palm wine soaked into the dirt. Then she looked up, her voice quiet but clear, like a drum beat in a funeral. "What do they call a woman who speaks when she should bow?" she asked the crowd, eyes sweeping across their shameful faces. "They call her unworthy." Then she carried the broken calabash pieces to the corner of the compound and placed the basket beside the clay oven she had built with her own hands years ago. The music never resumed. The drums never returned. But the silence was louder than anything that had come before. And Attica, even in her disgrace, stood taller than she had all morning. The dust clung to Attica's feet as she walked, the late afternoon sun biting her shoulders. Her anklets no longer jingled. The wrappers that once dazzled now sagged, dulled by sweat and shame. She passed the same huts that had once echoed her laughter during moonlit dances. But now, doors shut quietly as she approached. Curtains fluttered and voices fell silent. A group of young girls were singing by the well, playful, wild tunes about marriage and beauty. One of them saw Ataku and stopped mid-verse. The rest followed. The silence fell like a wet cloth. One girl looked at her with wide eyes, then turned away as if her gaze might catch the curse. Ataku kept walking. She could feel the red dust baking between her toes. The soles of her feet throbbed, but she did not wince. She did not pause. As she reached the family compound, her steps slowed. A few women stood near the cooking stones, gossiping while plucking bitter leaf. They looked up as she entered, hands pausing mid-tier. One woman, a distant cousin, clicked her tongue and turned her back. Another tightened her wrapper and whispered something to the third. None greeted her. Ijeoma, her younger sister, stood by the Udala tree, clutching a clay pot. She was only 19 but had eyes too old for her age. When she saw Ataku, she didn't run or smile like she usually did. She froze, pot trembling in her hands. Ataku tried to offer a smile, tired, crooked but real. "It's still me, Ijeoma?" Ijeoma nodded. But she didn't move. Inside, the house was thick with unsaid things. Her father's chair sat empty, his wrapper slung loosely over it. She heard him muttering behind the curtain that divided the rooms, his voice low and bitter. He had not eaten since the bride price was returned. Ataku walked past him without a word and made her way to the back hut, where the granary sat, cool, shadowed, and away from the rest of the compound. That night, she laid a woven mat beside sacks of millet and lay flat on her back, staring at the thatch roof. From the kitchen, she could hear her mother's voice breaking in the quiet. "We raised a daughter too strong for her own good," she whispered. "Too proud, too clever." Another voice, likely her aunt's, responded, "No man wants a wife who looks him in the eye. You should have softened her. She was born with a storm in her chest," her mother said, weeping now. "And I didn't know how to quiet it." Attica didn't cry. Her eyes stayed dry. But her chest ached in that silent way pain does when it has no name. Later that night, Ijeoma crept to the granary with a bowl of pepper soup. She sat quietly beside her, not speaking. Attica reached for the bowl but paused. "I'm sorry," Ijeoma whispered. They say I might not find a husband now. That your shame will follow me." Attica stared at the soup, the steam curling like ghost prayers. "You believe them?" she asked. Ijeoma hesitated, then looked away. Attica placed the bowl aside. "I'd rather eat sand than be swallowed by silence." A cock crowed somewhere in the distance, though the night was far from morning. The village slept. But for Attica, the weight of her own name felt heavier than ever. Tomorrow she would begin rising before the others, to wash early, eat last, and sleep where no one would notice. Her presence, once pride, had become shadow. But even as she curled her legs beneath her, wrapping her arms tight around herself, something inside her refused to shrink. She would not apologize for the fire in her, even if the whole village turned cold. By the time the third market day came, Attica's name had traveled farther than her feet ever had. In corners where spices were measured and salt was bartered, her story was retold, each version louder, sharper, more twisted than the last. The woman who dared speak during her bride negotiation. The girl who told her groom's mother she wouldn't be ordered like a goat. The daughter who brought disgrace to her father's lineage. "Did you hear?" one woman whispered while haggling over peppers. She refused to kneel when greeting his mother. She just stood there like a chief. Another added, and she said she wanted to choose her own land for her cooking hut. Can you imagine? She even asked if she could still sell her pots after marriage. What man wants a wife with business on her tongue? The worst part wasn't even the rumors themselves. It was how quickly people chose to believe them. When Attica stepped into the market with her clay pots balanced on a raffia tray, the air shifted. One by one, the women who used to wave now pretended not to see her. One woman turned her back. Another nudged her neighbor and muttered loud enough for Attica to hear, "She's brave to still show her face here." Attica set her pots down gently beneath the mango tree, just beside her usual spot. 4 months, her designs had been praised for their strength and storytelling. Animals carved into their sides, patterns of rivers and suns. Now no one came near. Mama Chima, who used to send her twin sons to help carry pots, looked straight past her as if her space had grown thorns. Even Ifyananya, her childhood friend who once braided her hair before dances, walked by with a sack of gari and didn't greet her. When Attica whispered her name, Ifyananya didn't even flinch. She stayed until the sun began to sink, and not a single pot was sold. That evening she carried them all back, every single one, back to the side of the granary. She sat in the reddish dust and began to reshape a broken one, her hands covered in clay and old grief. The next day she didn't return to the market. Instead, she set up her pots in the backyard behind the compound, carving new designs while smoke from her mother's cooking fire drifted in lazy circles above her. She etched stories into each pot now, of girls running through forests, of birds flying without cages, of hands raised instead of bowed. Her mother came out, drying her hands on her wrapper. "You should rest," she said not unkindly. "No one's buying." "I'm not carving for them," Attica replied. Her mother sighed and sat beside her on the low stool. "You could have said nothing that day. Let the men talk. Let the mother-in-law have her say. You could be in your husband's house by now." Attica kept working. "And lose myself before I even arrived? You think being silent is losing yourself?" her mother asked gently. Attica finally looked up. "Is silence the only dowry we're allowed to carry?" Her mother blinked, surprised. "I asked if I could keep selling my pottery," Attica continued, her voice quiet now. "That's all. I asked if I would be allowed to keep doing the only thing that ever made me feel mine." Her mother picked up one of the pots, tracing the carvings along its surface. "You know," she said after a while, "when I married your father, I was not allowed to speak for the first week. Not unless spoken to. Not unless permission was given. I thought that was how it had to be." Attica said nothing. Her mother placed the pot down gently. "Maybe you were born in the wrong time, Attica. Or maybe," Attica whispered, "this time was born for someone like me." A goat bleated in the distance. Somewhere beyond the compound walls, laughter burst out, followed by the thud of pestles and mortar. Life continued. But for Attica, every moment now felt like a tightrope between survival and self. She didn't return to the market the next week either. Instead, she focused on reshaping clay, creating pots with no buyers in mind. Her hands moved with purpose. Her silence now was chosen, not forced. And as the fire glowed in the clay oven behind her, her thoughts returned to the market square, the rumors, the rejection. Let them talk. One day they would find her name again on their lips. But next time they'd whisper it with wonder. The sun was gentle that morning, as if it too had decided to soften for once. A breeze rustled through the banana leaves behind the compound, and the clay pots Attica had lined up in her small backyard stall caught the early light like rows of sleeping drums. They shimmered faintly, newly dried, their carved patterns glowing with fresh ochre. Attica sat cross-legged, smoothing the mouth of a wide pot, her fingers dusted with fine red earth. She hummed quietly, a tune her mother used to sing while washing clothes by the river. There were no customers, there hadn't been for weeks, but her hands kept moving. She shaped for peace now, not for praise. Then came footsteps. Not rushed like the village children. Not heavy like the mocking elders. "Come." Even. She looked up. A man stood at the edge of her small stall. Tall, with clear brown eyes that didn't dart or scan with suspicion. Just eyes that looked, really looked. He wore a pale wrapper with chalk-stained hands. A book was tucked under one arm. Attica straightened slowly. "Good morning," he said. She nodded. "Good morning." He looked over the pots, not touching, just observing. "They say you carve proverbs into your work," he murmured. Attica blinked. "Only the ones that ask to be remembered." He smiled then, a real one, and picked up a pot with a carved fish swimming toward a spear. "This one?" She wiped her hand and stood. "It means, even when hunted, the fish keeps its grace." He turned the pot in his hands, the clay catching a soft line of sunlight. "How much?" Attica paused. She was used to bargaining. Used to having to explain the worth of her work. 500, she said softly. "Done." He reached into his satchel and placed the money gently in her palm, no hesitation, no counteroffer. Then he added, "I'd like 2 more. She stared at him, unsure if she'd misheard. "You want more?" He pointed to another with a carved doorway and a lone tree. "That one. And the one with the woman walking barefoot." He carried all 3 himself. Before he turned to leave, he said, "Obinna? That's my name." Attica gave a small nod. "Attica." He smiled again. "I know." By the time he left, the sky had turned brighter, and Attica stood still for a while, her fingers curled around the bills, her heart strangely quiet. News travels faster than wind in a village like theirs. By sunset, tongues had started wagging. He bought 3 of her pots? Without even touching them first. She bewitched him. Imagine, Obinna, the widower with 2 daughters, running after the girl whose bride price was spat back. At the evening well, 2 women cackled loudly. Maybe he likes women who speak like elders. She'll have his house spinning by full moon. Another said with a smirk, let him try. When she breaks his mother's plate, he'll understand. Obinna heard the laughter. He passed the group on his way home from school, a bundle of papers under one arm. The children trailing behind him giggled and waved at the women. One bold elder called out, "Teacher. So, you want the girl who refused to kneel, eh?" He didn't stop walking, but he called back, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe she wasn't meant to be bought." The words floated over them like smoke and silence followed. Attica heard of it the next day. Her mother stormed into the backyard, nearly tripping over a stool. "What is this I hear about a man buying pots again and again? You want them to say you're desperate now? You want them to believe you're selling more than clay?" Attica looked up from the pot she was glazing. "He paid what I asked." Her mother folded her arms, chest rising. "And that makes him a suitor?" Attica shook her head. "It makes him a man who sees me as I am." Her mother was quiet then. Not agreeing but not arguing either. Later that day Obinna returned. This time he brought his 2 daughters, both under 10, both wide-eyed and holding hands. They stood behind him like small trees behind a strong one. He didn't bring money this time, only a small calabash filled with roasted groundnuts. "For your work," he said. "And because my girls say your pots are magic." Attica smiled, and for the first time in many moons, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. The day Obinna returned with a calabash of palm honey and a quiet declaration on his tongue, the compound stirred like a restless drumskin. He wore no agbada of wealth, brought no basket stacked with wrappers or livestock tied with raffia. He came instead with his daughters, hands clean, eyes steady, and a voice that didn't tremble when he spoke. "I want to build with her," he said simply to Atticu's father, standing in the very spot where the bride price was once returned. "Not to buy her. Not to own her. Just to live beside her, with respect and peace." The old man blinked. At first he said nothing. Then he rose to his full height and asked coldly, "So that the shame will live in my house again?" Obinna didn't flinch. "There is no shame in honesty." Abadiah's voice cracked like dry firewood. "There is shame in disobedience. In speaking when no one asked. You want to bring disgrace here again? You think because you teach in a school you can unlearn our customs." Behind the curtain, Atticu's mother gasped softly. Igioma clutched the edge of the doorpost, her knuckles white. Obinna's daughter stood still, watching, silent, uncertain. "I do not offer bride price," Obinna said again. "I offer presence. Patience. The kind of love that doesn't need receipts." Abadiah raised a hand, palm open as if to silence the air itself. "Leave. And take this insult with you." Obinna nodded once and walked away. But his daughters lingered, just for a moment, then waved softly at Atticu who stood behind the house's eaves. One of them whispered, "Mama, will you come tomorrow?" The word cracked something in her chest. That evening her father didn't speak a word to anyone. He sat beside the hearth, staring at a pot Atticu had made years ago, now cracked, ash-stained, forgotten. He did not eat. He did not blink when her mother begged him to let go of the shame. His pride had taken root and it had grown too deep. Igioma stormed into the granary where Atticu now kept her peace. Her face was flushed, her braids loose. "Do you hate me that much?" she asked, voice trembling. "Do you want people to call us, the daughters of disgrace, forever?" Atticu looked up. "What are you talking about? If you marry him without bride price, without honor, no one will ever look at me with respect. The same men mocking you will mock me. What kind of sister are you?" Atticu stood slowly, wiping her hands on her wrapper. "The kind who chooses peace over pretending." Igioma's eyes glistened. "You sound just like mother. Saying strong things that don't help anyone." Atticu exhaled. "Igioma, is respect only given through a transaction?" Igioma shook her head but said nothing. Then quietly she turned and left. The elders called a meeting the next day. Abadiah insisted it was necessary, before the shame grew legs and danced across the village. They sat in a half-circle under the Udala tree, the breeze barely strong enough to move their wrappers. One by one they raised their voices. She bewitched him. That man used to be wise. No man brings daughters to ask for a wife unless something unnatural is pulling him. She should be punished, not praised. One younger elder, whose daughter had once tried to apprentice under Atticu, asked gently, "What if we are wrong? What if the girl simply wants to be chosen for who she is, not what she brings?" The others scoffed. Is that not what foolish girls always say? Back at her compound, Ataku sat between Obina's daughters. They were helping her clean newly fired pots, scrubbing them with fine sand. One of them asked, "Why don't you wear rings like the married women?" Ataku smiled faintly. "Because I haven't yet worn the kind of love that fits on a finger." They didn't understand, but they nodded anyway. The villagers whispered that she was feeding them, bathing them, preparing to take their mother's place. But in that small space behind the house, Attica didn't feel like she was replacing anyone. She was simply building. One day, while sweeping the courtyard, she whispered to herself, not knowing her mother stood nearby. "What if love is not bought but built?" Her mother didn't speak, but her eyes filled with something between grief and pride. That night the compound did not sleep. A storm had arrived, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those too scared to let a new kind of story unfold. The rain began with warning, the kind of sky that turns the color of boiled yam skin, swollen and low. Thunder rolled across the valley like ancestral drums, long before the first drop hit the dust. Attica was still kneading clay when the wind snapped the first branch outside the granary. By the time she stood, the storm had already arrived with full breath. Obina's compound took the worst of it. The thatched roof above the children's room peeled back like old skin, exposing rafters and the fragile bones of shelter. Rain poured into every corner, soaking mats, toppling calabashes, and tearing through the woven fence that held the cooking area. By morning, the village whispered about the damage, some with pity, some with amusement. "The schoolteacher's house is crying," one woman said. "Even his roof knows he has no head of house." Attica went early before the paths dried. She found Obina sweeping water from the corner of the main room with a broken broom, his daughters shivering under a wrapper. "You should have sent word," she said. He didn't look up. "There are things I've learned to fix alone." She took the broom from his hand. Together they worked in silence. She boiled hot water, wrung out blankets, patched raffia, and helped weave fresh palm fronds with the speed of someone who had known storms before. When the rain stopped for good 2 days later, she returned with a small purse of coins, money earned from 2 pots sold to travelers on the outskirts. "I don't want you to fix what you can't afford to carry," she said. Obina looked at the money, then at her, his voice soft. "You're not mine to owe. But still, thank you." She smiled. "Let's build something better this time." And they did. Together they tore down the crooked outdoor stove and replaced it with a compact, double-mouthed fire chamber. Attica added small clay ridges for multiple pots and carved holes beneath for ventilation. When it was done, the smoke danced higher, cleaner, curling toward the sky like a blessing. Soon the women began to notice. First, it was Obina's neighbor who came pretending to borrow salt but stared too long at the new stove. Then another came asking about the shape of the clay ridges. Before long, 3 women had started copying the design behind their own kitchens. One morning, while Attica shaped another stove for a widow nearby, her cousin Ngozi passed by with a loud voice and a sharper tongue. "So you're building stoves now?" she said, laughter curled around her words. "Careful, oh. Next thing you'll wear a belt and call yourself head of household." Attica stood slowly, wiping her hands on her wrapper. "No belt fits fire," she said simply. Ngozi scoffed. "You're trying to wear the man's trousers. It shows." People had begun gathering, a few women with firewood bundles, a young boy holding palm nuts. The air thickened. Then Obina arrived. He walked past everyone, stood beside Attica and looked directly at Ngozi. "A woman who builds is not competing," he said. "She's completing." Silence rippled through the gathering. Attica blinked. He had never said anything in public, not once. But now his voice carried like a drum's echo. "She didn't just fix what broke," he added. "She gave this home a new way to breathe." Ngozi muttered something under her breath and walked away. Later that evening, when the fire was lit and the new stove was warm, Attica sat with Obina and his daughters outside the repaired home. Smoke curled upward. One of the girls leaned on her shoulder. The other played with her anklet, giggling. Obina offered her a roasted piece of yam. "Thank you," he said again, this time quietly. Attica didn't reply. Because for once, everything she needed to hear had already been said. The sky that morning was innocent. Blue and wide, with little cotton clouds floating above like gossip not yet formed. Chickens clucked under courtyards. Mortars pounded yam. Smoke from early cooking fires curled into the air like prayers on the rise. The village was alive, celebrating a child's naming ceremony. Drums called out. Women in brightly woven wrappers danced in circles, their laughter mingling with the scent of roasted maize and palm oil stew. Obinna stood beside Adiku, helping adjust the beads around her neck, quiet pride in his eyes. His daughters tugged at her wrapper and pointed toward the sweet pile of puff-puff on the mat, giggling when she handed it to them before their father could protest. But joy is a thin rope, and it snapped. Someone screamed. Not the high-pitched squeals of play, but a scream made of fire and fear. Smoke thickened beyond the compound wall. Shouts replaced songs. Then came the stampede, bare feet slapping hard earth, mothers wailing names of missing children, pots forgotten, drums silenced. A nearby hut was burning. Fast. People ran away. But Attica ran toward. She didn't wait. Her head wrap flew off as she tore across the compound barefoot, skirts flapping. She ducked under the smoky eaves and into the chaos. Inside, the heat slapped her like a curse. A curtain was already aflame. A roof beam groaned above her like it would fall at any breath. She coughed and shouted, twice, before she heard a whimper. 2 children, twins, curled under a bench, their tiny bodies shivering despite the heat. She yanked off her wrapper, wrapped it around their heads, and carried one under each arm like clay pots too precious to break. She ran out as the beam collapsed behind her. The crowd gasped, then fell to silence. Atticus staggered out, smoke-blackened, sweat-drenched, trembling, but alive. The twins clung to her, dazed but unburned. Their mother dropped to her knees and wept into the ground. An elder whispered, "Oh Chinik," as if even the gods needed a moment. But the miracle wasn't just that she went in. It was that Obinna's daughters were already safe, because Attiku had insisted 2 moons ago that the back gate remain cleared at all times. In case of fire, she had said. Some had rolled their eyes. Others had muttered that she was being dramatic again. That she was too much. Now her too muchness had saved lives. And just like that, the village began to remember what it had forgotten. The girl who carved proverbs into her pots had also been carving foresight into their routines. The woman they once said talked like a man, had acted when even men stood frozen. The same one they mocked for wearing trousers in her spirit, had worn courage on her feet. That evening women whispered differently. That girl is not ordinary. She was made for more than marriage. Maybe we were wrong. Even the market woman who once turned her away brought a calabash of palm wine to Obinna's compound, shyly mumbling thanks. And then he came. Her former fiancé. He did not arrive with drums or an entourage. He came alone. Dressed plainly, walking like a man with pebbles in his shoes. He stood outside the compound for a long time before Obinna saw him and nodded quietly. Atticus stepped out. For a long time they said nothing. Then he spoke. I did not come to cause confusion. I'm married now. I have children. But I needed to say something, before the village rewrites what only we know. She raised an eyebrow. Waiting. I was afraid of you, he said. That's the truth. Not because you were wrong. But because I was too small to hold a woman like you. Attica didn't flinch. Her hands were folded calmly before her. She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't throw his truth back at him. She simply nodded, turned and walked back into the compound. Because some stories don't need a sequel. Later that night, Obinna found her sitting by the fire, gently oiling her calloused palms. He said nothing, just handed her a bowl of warm water and sat beside her. She looked into the fire and whispered, half to herself, half to him. When they say you are too much, what they fear is the mirror you hold to their smallness. And the flames nodded in agreement. The next morning, the pot she placed outside her stall was etched with a new proverb. What they once feared, they now call wisdom. And from that day on, even the breeze seemed to bow slightly when it passed her compound. Because the village had begun to see that Attica was not too much. They had simply expected too little. There was no announcement. No drumbeat. No grand goat parade of apology. Just the slow arrival of men in wrappers with walking sticks, gray at the temples, heavy with the scent of decisions long delayed. The elders had come. Not to question. Not to accuse. But to invite. Obinna saw them first and stood respectfully, unsure of their mission. Attica was in the backyard, smoothing red earth for her new kiln when his quiet call reached her ears. She wiped her hands on her wrapper and stepped out, dignified, unhurried. They greeted her not as a child of shame, but as a woman of standing. We've come not with dowries or demands, said the oldest among them, his voice thick like palm wine. But with ears and space. The Women's Guild, they've asked if you will speak. Attica blinked once. Then smiled, not the smile of surprise but the one worn by someone who already saw this coming, just not this soon. Speak about what? She asked softly. About how clay becomes a pot. And how a pot holds fire, and still sings, the man replied. So she said yes. That week, something began to hum through the village. A new sound. Familiar but changed, like the song of birds who had learned to perch without cages. Her family compound, once heavy with silence and side eyes, now moved with life. Cousins returned with food and laughter. Aunties who had once said, "You talk too much," now leaned in to hear her every word. Visitors came from nearby villages. Young girls sat at her feet as she carved symbols into clay, teaching not just technique but truth. "This line means strength. But strength drawn with grace," she'd say. "Here, this is the mark of silence broken." One girl asked, "How did you learn all this?" Ataku paused, running her thumb over the smooth rim of a finished pot. "By being told to be quiet and refusing," she said. They laughed. But there was reverence in their laughter. Even her mother, who once told her to shrink, now hovered with quiet pride. She no longer said, "Speak less." Instead she asked, "Will you wear my necklace to the guild meeting? The one I wore when I was your age." And Attica did. The day of the gathering arrived like sun after too many rains. The women's guild hall, woven from mud, wood and memories, was packed. The walls had held generations of stories, but never one quite like this. Attica stood at the front, wearing the necklace and her favorite sky blue wrapper. She didn't carry a scroll. Just one of her pots, the newest one, etched with the words, "The fire did not break me. It shaped me." She began simply. "I was once told that a woman should be like a pot, silent, still, only useful when filled with others' needs." Soft chuckles rippled through the room. But what if the pot could speak? What if it carried its own story, not just stew? Heads nodded. Eyes brightened. She told them about clay that cracks, about hands that mold, about refusing to harden too quickly, and about how her worst day, the day her bride price was returned, had become her best. "I was not rejected," she said. "I was reformed." After her speech, the women broke into song, not the usual performance tune but a humming of thanks. A song without drums, made only by voices and tears and deep agreement. And outside, in the shadow of the compound, her father waited. He had not gone in. He had stood behind the pillar, listening as one does when unsure of their place in the story. Now, as she stepped out, cheeks kissed by sun and praise, he raised his eyes. For a long time he said nothing. Then he opened his hand, revealing a small object, the original list of bride price items, now worn and creased, folded in quarters. He held it out. "Your bride price," he said, voice rough like a rusted gate, "was sent back." She nodded, remembering. "But what you brought back," his eyes misted. "What you've built, what you've become, that cannot be priced." He tucked the paper into the fire pit beside them, watching it curl to ash. Behind them, young girls continued singing softly. The melody floated up, higher than shame, stronger than the memory of rejection. It wrapped around the compound like perfume, like belonging. And Attica, standing there, clay still under her fingernails, whispered only to herself, "May we all return, so full, so free, that the gates must open in song." It was not called a wedding. No bell rang. No flute summoned dancers from distant compounds. But the air knew. The wind carried something softer than celebration, but heavier than a mere gathering. It was the sound of something old closing, and something honest beginning. At Obina's compound, women gathered. Some from the village. Others from beyond the river. 3 neighboring communities had sent word. "We heard of the woman who made the stove that doesn't burn too hot. We want one." They did not ask if she was married. They didn't need to. They saw the walls she'd plastered with her own hands. The designs she had drawn into the courtyard. The warmth in Obina's daughter's eyes when they said, "Mama made that." A large pot steamed in the middle of the yard, goat meat, peppers and scent leaves. Children circled, already holding calabashes. The air smelled of earth and spice and women's work. But it wasn't the pots or the stew that brought tears to some eyes that day. It was Igioma. She arrived quietly, wrapped in soft gold with coral beads at her wrist. Her belly had begun to show. Her fiancé, a gentle palm wine tapper, waited respectfully near the gate. But Igioma walked in alone, holding something hidden in cloth. Attica saw her and stood. They had not spoken deeply in months. Not since the fire. Not since the village had started singing her name instead of whispering it. But now, as Igioma approached, something in both their shoulders dropped. "I thought," Igioma said, unwrapping the cloth, "you might wear this." It was a woven crown of palm fronds and seashells, fragile in the wrong hands, but beautiful if worn with care. I made it when I heard women were coming from other villages to buy your pots, Ijeoma added. I thought, they should know who the real firebringer is. Ataku took the crown with shaking hands. Ijeoma, she said, voice low, I was never angry at you. I just wanted you to love me more than you feared them. I did, Ijeoma said. I just didn't know how to show it. Then without another word the sisters embraced. Someone struck a drum, not with force but with a rhythm that invited movement, not performance. And slowly the compound began to dance. No choreographed steps. No matching rappers. Just bodies remembering joy. Obina's daughters sang in their soft, high voices. Mama, the one who brings fire and food. The one who made our house good. Mama, the one who held the flame. But never burned us with her name. Ataku wore the crown as she moved, graceful, light. She didn't lead the dance. She didn't follow. She just was. In her element. In her truth. Old aunties watched from mats, fanning themselves. That girl, one whispered, she was not a bride. No, the other replied. She's the firewood. The stove. The hands. The home. Later, as moonlight fell across sleeping children and humming women, someone asked Obina if they would ever do a proper wedding. He only smiled. This was the ceremony, he said. A gathering of stories. That's all marriage ever was supposed to be. No bride price had been exchanged. No dowry. But hands had been held. Wounds had been healed. And in the silence of night, after all the voices had rested, Ataku stood once more in the center of the yard. She looked at the empty plates. The dancing footprints. The clay stove still warm from the evening meal. She placed the woven crown on the stool where she once sat to shape pots alone. And she whispered. She was not a bride they could buy. She was a woman they would one day thank. She was told her bride price had been sent back. As if she were a basket of yams that didn't ripen. As if a woman's worth could spoil under the gaze of gossip. They said, it's over. They said, don't look back. They said, no man will come again. As if she had been made for purchase. As if love could be weighed like millet at the market. As if spirit, strength, and softness had a price tag. But she didn't cry where they expected tears. She didn't plead where they hoped for shame. She didn't shrink into silence nor hide her hands. Instead she picked up clay. She bent to the earth not to beg, but to build. Every morning her fingers carved meaning into mud. She made pots that held more than water. They held parables. They held patience. They held proof that rejection does not ruin a woman. Sometimes it reveals her. While they whispered she worked. While they watched she watered her purpose. While they waited for her to break. She bloomed. No husband. No wedding. No family chance in her name. And yet, the village gate opened wider every week. Women came for the stoves. Children came for the stories. Even elders came quietly, to listen. She was not called wife. But she was called blessing. She was not seated in marriage cloth. But she stood in her own light. And when the widowed schoolteacher walked in, not with cattle or coins, but with kind words and 2 daughters needing home, she did not swoon. She did not barter her dignity. She simply said, let's build something worthy of our wounds. Not a romance that erases the past, but one that honors it. She swept no shame under the mat. She used it as kindling. To light fires in kitchens that had gone cold. They said she was too forward. Too strange. Too much. But Obina said, too much is what saves us when too little fails. And so they built. A house without permission. A life without apologies. When fire came to the village, she didn't run. She rescued. When drought came, she molded new pots that kept water cool. When judgment came, she met it with work. And little by little, the village's song began to shift. They had once chanted about her shame. Now they hummed about her strength. They had once warned their sons to stay away. Now they sent their daughters to braid her hair. And ask how to make pots that speak. Even her sister, once torn between fear and loyalty, brought her a crown woven with palm fronds. Not gold. Not coral. Just leaves and intention. And it fit her head like a truth too long delayed. In a yard not built for ceremony, she danced. Not in lace. Not in high heels. Barefoot, surrounded by voices. That once accused her. Now singing her name like praise. She didn't need to be anyone's bride. She had become everyone's lesson. That day, under the soft breath of the moon, with children laughing and women clapping, a new kind of story was carved into the compound walls. That rejection is not the end, but often the beginning of a story that costs nothing to tell, but everything to live. That a woman who returns not to beg, but to bless, is no longer part of the gossip. She becomes part of the gospel. That shame, when sifted through courage, turns into a song. And oh, how they sang. Old men drummed without knowing why. Young girls wept without knowing how. And in the quiet of that firelit night, the village finally saw her. Not as someone whose bride price had been sent back, but as someone who brought back something priceless. She brought back forgiveness that didn't seek applause. She brought back strength that didn't shout. She brought back joy that didn't borrow permission. She brought back a new way to love. Unbought, unboxed, unbent. And they said, "She is not a woman we can contain. She is a wind we must learn to welcome." She had not changed. They had. They finally learned what only brave eyes see. That a woman who does not beg to be chosen is not waiting. She is already choosing herself, her peace, her purpose, and those wise enough to walk beside her. She did not come back to prove them wrong. She came back to prove herself right. And the compound, once heavy with silence, now hummed with truth, not because her hands were full, but because her heart was. Not because they crowned her, but because she crowned herself. She was never lost. She was just ahead of her time. And now they follow the sound of her footsteps. Now they tell their daughters her story. Now they admit what they were too proud to say, that her return was the thing that saved them. Because what she brought back was not a dowry or a dance, but a deeper kind of dignity, one that could not be bought, only built.